Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the topic of my lecture today is the scope of reason, part 1. I've already said something in the introduction about changes in Popper's view of the scope of reason, and also about the significance of these changes. In this lecture, I'm going to say a bit more about this. I'll also discuss 2 other topics. Let me effectively restart. I've already said something about changes in Popper's view of the scope of reason and about the significance of those changes. And in this lecture, I'm going to say more about this. I'll also, though, discuss 2 other topics. First, how this issue of the scope of reason relates to Popper's ideas about politics. Second, I'll discuss the role of reason in the development of science. There is a third issue which can be connected with this issue of the scope of reason, namely issues relating to Bill Bartley, the question of whether Popper is in some ways or was in some ways a fideist, and to the idea of so-called comprehensively critical rationalism. That will be discussed in a later lecture. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in the course, in the introduction, Popper isn't, and he wasn't, a positivist. At the time, however, when he wrote The Logic of Scientific Discovery, he was concerned that he couldn't defend particular metaphysical positions which he wished to hold as being rational. His view about metaphysics differed from that of many of the members of the Vienna Circle. They typically wish to expunge it as meaningless, to the point where in their discussions, Neurath, for example, was supposed sometimes, if someone said something that he didn't like, was supposed to have made sort of loud noises objecting to it as metaphysics. Popper, as I've mentioned, took metaphysical claims typically to be meaningful and, for example, in some cases to have been played an important heuristic role in the development of science. Be that as it may, one of Popper's concerns in The Logic of Scientific Discovery was to try to avoid the idea that we have to make metaphysical presuppositions when we're doing science, even when he may himself have held particular metaphysical views. So in one way, you can see The Logic of Scientific Discovery as having been written in such a way that it doesn't make metaphysical assumptions, even though Popper himself had certain metaphysical views. Popper's characteristic move, if he came across such things, was to suggest that we should instead treat metaphysical claims that some people suggested underpin science as rather being hypostatizations or kind of illegitimately pumped up versions of methodological rules. And he took that view because at the time he thought that methodology was something which could be rationally assessed, whereas he didn't know how to do this in terms of metaphysics. One example of this was his suggestion in The Logic of Scientific Discovery that we should treat the metaphysical thesis of determinism, like every effect has a cause or something of this, or a determining cause, instead as a proposal that we should always continue to seek for causal explanations of phenomena, taking it as a methodological injunction rather than as a metaphysical claim. This was a methodological approach, rather, that Popper argued was fruitful, that it was fruitful to take, and the usefulness of which he thought stood independently of whether or not determinism was in fact true, or if possibly it was false. Popper uses in some ways a similar approach to metaphysical issues in his Open Society, but there he discusses in passing some of Whitehead's views about metaphysics. Alfred North Whitehead had been a collaborator of Bertrand Russell's in their work together on logic, but he then moved to the United States and became more interested in offering a kind of very expansive metaphysical views. Popper claims that the problem with Whitehead's ideas is that they're just simply presented to us. That's to say, he doesn't give any indication of how we are to evaluate the views that he's putting forward. And further, that while Whitehead speaks about there having been progress in metaphysics, he gives no indication at all of what such progress would consist of, or how claims about something that has progressed or otherwise might be evaluated. How can we assess whether progress is being made if there are changes in such views? I've earlier referred in passing to one consequence of this kind of approach in the logic of scientific discovery. That's to say that while for Popper, the aim of science, or rather a choice between different conflicting views of the aims of science, plays a key role in his epistemology between his realism and conventionalism, in the logic of scientific discovery, while Popper says a little bit about why he likes what amounts to a realist view, he leaves it ultimately as being a matter for people simply to decide which view they want to take, thus leaving it open for someone to choose to take a conventionalist view and then to adopt the kind of methodology which would fit such an approach, which would make sense on that sort of basis. But as we've seen, he later defended realism in a much stronger way. He stressed that it's open to argument. I mean, clearly, it's always possible in philosophy for people to take one side or other of a particular ongoing argument, but he wants to argue later that there is the possibility of rational assessment of such things. There is a partial parallel to both parts of this. That's to say, the decisionism, but also the critical evaluation in his discussion of ethical topics in the Open Society. Popper's Open Society was in part a critique of ideas which he believed underlay both Marxism and fascism. And he pursued his engagement with these ideas by way of a critical engagement with Plato and with Marx. If you say, well, what has Plato got to do with it? There is quite an interesting essay in the collection after the Open Society, which Popper must have given fairly soon as a talk, fairly soon after the publication of the Open Society, in the course of which he says that when he was teaching Plato, I guess this was in New Zealand, he was struck that there was a kind of strange parallel in some ways between some things that he found in Plato, not the main lines of his philosophical argument, but certain of the other kind of things going on, and some of Adolf Hitler's ideas. And what he was critical of in the open society and in the poverty of historicism was especially the idea that there is an intrinsic direction to history, that there is, as it were, a plot to history, which also should be understood as being ethical in its character. So if you consider those Marxists who stress this notion, then typically their view was that the coming of socialism is inevitable, or if it doesn't come, it would be a complete disaster. But that it's both inevitable, but also something that is good and desirable, and which it would be futile and indeed also immoral to resist. In part, Popper offered a restatement for his own day of ideas which might be described as a Kantian or Republican form of liberalism. And by this I mean one which stresses the importance of the autonomy of each individual and of their ability to live their own lives free of supervision by other people. I mean, Popper put this at one point in the following terms, that he said he really wouldn't be happy if he were living almost in an ideal society, if everything really depended, as it were, on the discretion of angels, that in a good society, individuals should be free to make their own choices and to make their own mistakes. In Popper, this notion, which is strongly related to the autonomy of ethics, the autonomy of the individual, is also married up with a concern for the relief of suffering and the remedying of injustice. You have these two kinds of things going on, but where his whole approach was strongly influenced by his epistemology, by his theory of knowledge, and in particular by his fallibilism. When Popper wrote his book, his views about the limits of reason were much as they were in the logic of scientific discovery, much as I previously indicated. But there is an important qualification to this, to which I will turn. Popper, in his response to some criticisms that Berkeley made of him at the 1965 Bedford College conference, something that I'm going to be talking about in a later lecture, stressed the significance of ideas about openness to criticism and the notion in his open society of what he called the rational attitude. That's to say, that we should accept our infallibility and that we should go into discussions with one another in the expectation that we might have something useful to learn from one another, and where the rational attitude is also very much characterized by the idea that we should be interested in aiming at what's true rather than one-upmanship on one another, or just say pressing our own personal interests. This notion is certainly there in the open society, but also it seems to me one doesn't really have a theory about the character of these things developed in the open society itself. That's to say, I suggested at Philip's, responding to a point that Philip had put to me in the discussion before, that it would be useful to say a little bit about what each of these lectures was concerning. And I managed to give him the wrong reference for this, but I will now just read out what, in a sense, could be the text for this lecture. Popper was talking on page 40 of Objective Knowledge. In footnote 9, he's saying, I describe myself as a metaphysical realist at that point. However, I wrongly identified the limits of science with those of arguability. I later changed my mind and argued that non-testable metaphysical theories may be rationally arguable. And what I'm saying here really is that he held, I think, that earlier view really at the time at which he was writing The Open Society. So while he talked in The Open Society about the rational attitude, he doesn't actually give us a theory about how this sort of stuff works, just because to do so would involve him in needing to have to hand his ideas about the rational assessment of metaphysics and also implicitly of ethics. Popper's approach to key ethical issues in The Open Society seems to me in some ways rather decisionistic, in a way in which it need not have been had he had such a theory available. So you get in The Open Society much of the weight of his argument being carried by points about epistemology or methodology, which fell within his earlier ideas about the scope of rationality. But in a way that came over rather strangely, Popper's decisionism about the aims of science in the logic of scientific discovery could be said to be paralleled by, in some ways, similar treatments of ethical issues in The Open Society. Just as Popper had made clear what his favored view was as to the aims of science, he was clear-cut about his substantive ethical viewpoint in The Open Society. Not only was he an ethical individualist in the sense that he held that it was individual people, not entities like the state, which mattered ethically, but that he favored what he called a protectionist approach to them. That's to say, that it was important, in Popper's view, for the state to protect the individual, not only from interference, so you have some of the kind of things that liberals would often stress, but also Popper wants to say the state should protect people against economic exploitation, while in addition, he favored governmental initiatives to remedy injustice and to address people's suffering. We'll return later in the course to the substance of his political and ethical ideas. For now, what is important is that while I think he made no secret of the fact that he was concerned about these things, he emphasized strongly that these things were matters for people's decision. This way of putting things might be thought, and someone has suggested this, as almost anticipating existentialism. But this would seem to me to be a mistaken view. For on the one side, when he stressed individual decisions, and also one finds in a lot of his earlier writing about ethical themes, both in The Open Society and in the papers from New Zealand period, in after The Open Society, when he places emphasis on the individual's conscience, he was taking up a particular strand in Kantian ethics, which stressed the autonomy of ethics from outside influences, including from commands made by God. So for Popper, it is if God commands someone to do something, it is for the individual to decide whether that is or isn't the right thing to do. On the other side, an important influence in how these things were put was, I think, Popper's earlier view of the limits of reason. In addition, however, one point in respect of which Popper was, I think, to be found in agreement with Wittgenstein, I tended to stress their disagreement about things, was that they both really hated pretentious verbiage about ethics and tended to be skeptical about meta-ethical theory. Now one might ask, what was Popper's view about meta-ethics? I think it's actually a bit difficult to say because he had an aversion really to discussing the subject. When later a correspondent of his, it was a guy who was, I think, he was certainly working at a Catholic college. He may himself have been a Catholic priest, if not a Catholic layman, wrote to Popper about this. Popper said, yes, there is really a gap in this area about my work. What Popper says about these things in the Open Society seems to me not terribly helpful. He clearly has, as I've noted, a strongly Kantian sense of the autonomy of ethics, and he agrees, for example, with Kant about the importance of the golden rule. And he likes what Schopenhauer had to say about ethics. Do not hurt anybody, but help everybody as well as you can. He favors the view that we should respond to suffering and injustice. He stresses also the significance of our decisions. He says that decisions and conventions aren't arbitrary, but what he doesn't do, and what someone who is after really, or is very keen on a meta-ethics here, would ask, well, in the light of what are we to criticize our ethical choices and our ethical decisions? And what's the status of that? And you really just don't get Popper addressing that question. However, as I've argued in my book, The Political Thought of Karl Popper, which deals a bit with these things, it's not easy to put into a systematic form what little Popper says about the subject of ethics, because different things, in effect, pull one off in different directions. However, there are two other sources which, if one's interested in this, may be relevant. The first is some lectures that he gave at Emory University in 1956. These exist only in the form of some notes in the Popper archives and also of a partial recording. By this, it should be said, hangs a tale. There was at that time a distinctive system available in the United States for the recording of meetings and of talks. And what happened was that it effectively cut discs or produced discs on sort of floppy bits of plastic, which, if, however, they looked like a gramophone record, but if you played them on a gramophone, they weren't speed adjusted. So they would start off going very, 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 very quickly. And then as you got towards the middle, they'd be at normal pace. And then at the center, they would slow right down. So one has these recordings. It's only a partial recording. The recording system wasn't good. There was extraneous noise. There was a microphone, which obviously must have been a fixed microphone, and Popper moved up and down the room. So the result of this is that one has, as it were, fragments from which one can get a few ideas about what he was wanting to say. I've made a transcription of these things, but as the recording is so patchy, it's just not clear sometimes quite what was going on. And so I had to use a bit of guesswork. But at one point, after making a critical comment about the old tradition of natural law as seen as something that is timeless and also possibly given to us by God, he suggests that we can criticize our moral ideas in the light of developing moral intuition. This theme of moral learning is one which some full-blown moral realists, for example, David McNaughton in his Moral Vision, have stressed the significance of when arguing for moral realism. And Popper, in an appendix written in 1961 to Volume 2 of the Open Society, was willing to draw a certain parallel between truth and the validity of our moral values. And this certainly seemed to suggest in this that you could draw some parallels between Popper's epistemological ideas, in which we're aiming at truth, and what is happening when we are trying to aim at valid, genuine moral values. There, Popper wrote, and I quote, "We may take the idea of absolute truth, of correspondence to the facts, as a kind of model for the realm of standards, in order to make it clear to ourselves that, just as we may seek for absolutely true propositions in the realm of facts, or at least for propositions which come nearer to the truth, we may seek for absolutely right or valid proposals in the realm of standards, or at least for better or more valid proposals." So in that appendix, he stresses some possibilities of drawing a parallel between his epistemology and philosophy of science and what is going on in ethics. However, this and a reiteration of the point about discovering moral error is about as far as he goes. So he doesn't move on from this to offering a kind of systematic theory of the character of ethics, of just what is going on when moral learning is taking place, and so on. In my view, personally, what he stands in need of is a full-fledged theory of ethics in which intersubjective scrutiny plays a key role. But that, as they say, would be another story, one at which I've elsewhere made an initial attempt, but Popper himself didn't offer such a thing. I have suggested that Popper's criticisms of the notion of the epistemological significance of individual certainty, which he discusses in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, might also possibly be applied to the judgments of an individual's conscience. That's to say, we tend to uphold individual conscientious judgments as being important. But why? I mean, if we are concerned with ethical truth, why should we think that individuals have it right in these cases when, in respect of cases that are analogous to this, where we're making factual claims or advancing metaphysical theories, we say our claims have to be open to intersubjective scrutiny? At any rate, I've played around with this a bit. There are, if one, in the unlikely event of anyone finding anything that I had to say about this plausible, there are ways of reinstating the status of the individual conscience, but I won't bother you with that at the moment. And I think Popper didn't offer such a theory, perhaps indeed for very good reasons. I also think, for reasons which I'll explain later, that we need to offer tentatively a metaphysics of ethics as well. That's to say, a tentative theory about what kind of thing is going on if we're talking about ethical standards and the possibility of a movement analogous to a movement towards truth, but in respect of those. But back now to issues that arose immediately after the Open Society. I'm then going to come back to some other things in the Open Society in itself. It's worth noting, however, that just after the Second World War, Popper attended a philosophy conference in the Netherlands. At this, a Professor Russell from Birmingham, it isn't Bertrand Russell, it's another chap called Russell, gave a paper on the theme of propositions and proposals. And Popper was impressed by this and then made reference to it in a paper of his own when it was published that was given at this conference, and subsequently he referred to it in later editions of the Open Society. This rather limited idea was that a proposal is something which of its very nature may be discussed. And Popper henceforth wished to stress this as distinct from simply using the terminology of decisions or the issuing of propositions about ethical things. He wanted to stress their discussability. Even if he didn't at this point have a theory about how this was to be done beyond what he says in the course of the Open Society itself about the critical attitude. If, like Popper in the Open Society, you stress the limitations of reason, what do you do in the face of moral and political disagreement? Popper's views seem to be that implicitly there wasn't a great deal to be done in the face of certain kinds of ethical disagreement as such. On the one side, people may be simply anti-humanitarian in their values. And Popper, it seems to me, really doesn't say anything about how one can engage with them, at least in the sense that his arguments in the Open Society seem typically to be directed towards people who have underlying humanitarian concerns, but who Popper thinks have been misled into taking anti-democratic and anti-humanitarian perspectives. Popper engages critically with those, for example, like Leonard Nelson's followers, who in Popper's judgment had really been misled by Plato, and also he engages with those who he thinks have been misled by Marx. His arguments in all this are really threefold. First, he offers various methodological arguments against ideas which he thinks have led to ethical and political problems. For example, against the historicist view that there is a plot to history. And he stresses against this the idea that what will happen is in our hands, and in this respect is our ethical responsibility. I think, however, and he's coming through a bit of criticism about his argument in The Poverty of Historicism, but it seems to me that one really can spell out what was going on properly only if we have to hand Popper's later ideas about metaphysical research programs, and to see what Popper is doing is they're engaging with the plausibility of the idea of certain kinds of historicism as a good way to be guided in politics and in the development of social science. That's to say, I think if you don't have that to hand, it's a little difficult to explain quite what the status is of Popper's own argument. Second, Popper argues that these views do indeed, that's to say, the Platonic views and the Marxian views, have anti-humanitarian consequences. Popper's own reading on this score of Plato seems to me in some ways a bit like a certain kind of Marxist account. By this, I mean that the thrust of Popper one would possibly expect to be against the claims to knowledge which are being made on the part of Plato's guardians. One might expect Popper to stress fallibilism. One might expect him to stress the notion that the Platonic elite just really aren't entitled to be sure of themselves in the way in which they seem to be when they think that they're entitled to rule. But Popper tends rather to stress the problems about what Popper is saying concerning the status of ordinary people, and he takes issue with what he has to say about democracy. It is, though, and there's some interesting material in After the Open Society about this, that Popper had an exchange of letters with the classical historian Ernst Badian, who wrote to Popper and defended, in many ways, Plato and Aristotle against some of Popper's criticism, essentially saying, look, the situation for ordinary people in the times when Plato and Aristotle were living was just terrible. And there was no real way in which it could be improved. And in the face of this, to think of their being actively involved in politics just really doesn't make much sense. But at any rate, there's an interesting exchange of letters, which with Badian's permission, we were able to include in After the Open Society. But one might see in what Popper advanced, an argument which would appeal to those who have strong humanitarian concerns. There is an interesting example of what broader argument of this kind might look like in Popper's Open Society, chapter 24. Popper there discusses a minor figure in George Bernard Shaw's play, St. Joan. This person had been calling for her death, sort of burn the heretic type of stuff, and he gets what he wants. She is burned to death. And this guy is shattered by seeing her actually being burned to death. Popper quotes Shaw as having that person then say, I meant no harm. I didn't know what it would be like. Popper, in this context, stresses the importance of analyzing the consequences or the likely consequences will follow from our decisions in a concrete and practical way, and thus as to whether we would actually find these things ethically acceptable. He stresses, however, that such analysis can't determine our moral decisions, and that some people indeed knew exactly what they were doing and still decided to do it. That's to say that some people might indeed have said, yes, I know all about executions, I know exactly how bad they are, and this is what she deserves. Popper is also critical of the idea of judging the conduct of others, whereas it seems to me personally that the kind of intersubjective scrutiny of one another's behavior that Adam Smith stresses the importance of in his theory of moral sentiments is actually just the kind of thing that a critical rationalist would welcome. So I'm here suggesting that one could take the theme of intersubjectivity from what Popper had to say about basic statements and say, well, this should also apply to our ethical judgments as well. You may say, no, that really doesn't work for the following reason, but I think it's worth exploring just what the consequences would be of opening up our ethical judgments to other people rather than there just being things which are matters of individual decision. Indeed, Popper criticizes the idea of a science of ethics, whereas I would have thought that if by parallel with that appendix in his Open Society, one is something of an ethical objectivist, then I'd have thought that actually something closer to a science of ethics is what one indeed should be aspiring to, namely something to which we as individuals can turn for instruction, while at the same time stressing its fallible character and its openness to critical emendation in the light of good arguments. Third, Popper argues, though I think this is implicitly to invoke some notions about social theory, that the hope that people have had about returning from conditions like our own to a stronger sense of community is futile. His argument is that the kind of abstract society in which we're living brings with it certain tensions which there just isn't the possibility of resolving by return to a richer kind of community which we supposedly enjoyed in the past. And I just say in passing here, Popper, while he is an ethical individualist in the sense of saying that it's individual well-being and suffering that matter, he is not a kind of figure on the new right. I mean, he was a member of the Montpellier Society, but he was never a kind of gung-ho free marketeer. But in this material, he is to be found raising some quite interesting points, which I think need to be taken seriously by people who stress the ideal of communitarianism, namely the question, well, how in a society like ours could one actually get back to something like a deeper notion of shared community? Indeed, Popper's view is that an attempt to do this is likely simply to produce authoritarianism and a closed society. And I would just say in passing, I mean, Popper is sometimes taken as being a critique of tribalism. I don't think this is a particular preoccupation of his. His concern rather was that at the time at which he was writing and when his political ideas had been formed, especially during the 1930s, there were these calls for the restoration, in some sense, of a folk community. And it's this, namely an attempt to get back to some of the features that we might have had in the past, which, but put as the agenda for the future, which Popper thinks is likely to lead to terrible consequences. It's worth noting that the target of Popper is thus really those who want to try to return to stronger ideas about community that we perhaps enjoyed in the past. It's striking, though, that while Popper has such a view, and while there is an important parallel here with the writings of Friedrich Hayek, who was critical equally of this kind of notion, Popper himself didn't offer us an explanation as to why this is the case, or of what the constraints are upon us which stop us from being able to meet positively such concerns. And I'd say in this respect, I mean, Popper was doing many, many other things, but it's striking, I think, that there is a gap in the open society in terms of telling us about how an open society works and what its possibilities might be, and also what is ruled out and why. This leads us to another group of people, those who hold humanitarian values, but who are in mutual disagreement about some other things. These Popper addresses notably in an essay, Public and Private Values. This was written in about 1946, and it was one of the things that, after looking at it in the archives, I decided should be published in the collection of Popper's writings on social and political themes after the Open Society. Popper's argument here is that humanitarians may differ in respect of their ideological beliefs. But the time at which he was writing, he was saying, look, there may be people who are humanitarian, but who also are liberal, or who are humanitarian, but are socialist, or people who are humanitarian, but whose strong motivation is Christian, or people who are humanitarian, but who really see themselves as being utilitarians. And Popper says that there is a problem in that these people have got a range of positive ideals. They are incompatible with one another to the point where what for a socialist might be an ideal might for a liberal be totally intolerable, because that ideal, the very ideal that a socialist is putting forward, would involve a degree of regulation and supervision of individuals, where for the liberal would say, no, 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 not at all. I mean, people need to be free to try out and do their own things, to make their own mistakes, and in many respects to suffer the consequences of these things. And where if Popper was there arguing, if you compare these different ideals, you may indeed have critical exchanges between them, but you're not likely to get any degree of consensus about their positive visions. Popper's strategy, however, is then to argue that it would be possible for such people to explore how much they could agree about concerning what is unacceptable. And the notion here is that you may have people who are in real disagreement with one another about what a good society would look like, but who perhaps might say, but yes, of course, I mean, we need to get assistance to kids who are orphaned or in danger. We need to be able to get shelters for women if they are in bad domestic arrangements and so on. We may need to get together to supply people in poorer countries with vaccines which they need. And a number of other things of this kind where they still disagree about the big ideals. There may be this list of rather more limited things where actually they could find themselves in a good measure of agreement. Popper suggests that while they may be in strong disagreement about their positive views as to what would make for a good society, they may, if asked what in their view is unacceptable, be able to discover a good deal of common ground. They would, in effect, be being asked to see if they can determine what the highest common factors between their views are. Highest common factors in the sense of what is the most they can all agree is problematic. And Popper suggests that these things, what they can agree is in need of remedy, should then be taken as an agenda for governmental action, where while their positive ideals become issues for private initiative. It's clear, however, that there may also be significant disagreements here. That's to say, the utilitarian may be all in favor of voluntary euthanasia and abortion, the Christian deeply against it, and unhappy that it occur even on a voluntary basis elsewhere in the society. So there is the question of whether this business of the private pursuit of these contested things, albeit on a consensual basis amongst those who are engaged in that, would be acceptable. 3 points here might be noted. First, Popper's view differs from the similar but explicitly political theme in Cass Sunstein and in the later John Rawls, just because it's focused on the negative. And this is just an aside, as it were, because one can find in what Sunstein says about incompletely theorized agreements and Rawls in aspects of his political liberalism, things were a little bit like these suggestions of Popper's. But Popper is focused on agreement about the negative, and Popper also has the St. Joan material. That's to say, an approach which people might make use of in critical discussion between the different views. Also, if people are offering their ethical views in the context of metaphysical and religious theories, Popper's ideas about the critical appraisal of metaphysical theories might be of use to us. Although this wasn't an approach that Popper himself developed. Second, even if there's agreement about what needs to be addressed, there may still be a problem about how people think that this should be done. That's to say, the liberal and the socialist may have very different views about the kind of action that should be taken by government to remedy problems on the pertinence of which they agree, and these may not be points which can be resolved empirically between them. And also, it seems to me that Popper needs a theory about what is intrinsically valuable. That's to say that there are these two different elements in Popper's approach. On the one side, there is his protectionism in respect of the individual, and then there's this issue of the agenda for political action. But it seems to me that he doesn't really say much about what, in a sense, is intrinsically valuable about individuals so that they need to be protected. And clearly, once you try this, you get into all kinds of complications. What is the status of animals? What is the status of the senile? What is the status of someone who offers to give lectures about Popper, but then seems to lose track? And what is the status? And you can fill it in for yourself, but there are a bunch of complications that come up here. I'm going to conclude this lecture by discussing two issues, both of which, in my view, should lead us towards actually explicating some ethical theory and some metaphysics. That's to say, taking Popper or a critical rationalist approach into areas where he didn't really want to be. The first relates to what is being protected in Popper's approach, what I was just alluding to. In effect, he works with something like individual rights, which on his account are to be protected by the state, and which really set up boundaries within which piecemeal social engineering takes place. I mean, that's to say that Popper's protectionism would look to me to be barriers against certain kinds of, say, governmental activity to address problems just on the grounds that it would say, well, these things you mustn't do to individuals, just using them as instruments towards those other agreed purposes. I'd have a couple of comments to make about all this. First of all, Popper seemed to me to take a slightly odd view about these things, in that one reaction might be, surely, we often need also to be protected against the state. So with Popper, to see the state as the source and the guardian of these things looks to me to be problematic. I mean, I think it's okay in some respects. In other respects, there is the problem, well, what about what the state may do to us? We can certainly see governmental institutions, along with other institutions, as having a positive role here. But given that governments typically have a monopoly of force, and in one way or other can exercise a huge amount of power, I personally don't think that seeing this as a matter just for government or the state is really the right way to go. I think one needs a bit more said about all of this stuff. A second issue here is that I personally think that it's good that Popper doesn't discuss protectionism in what has now become the almost ubiquitous language of human rights. My reason for this, which I can only sketch here, is that it seems to me that we need to develop two distinct sorts of idea here about moral patienthood. The first addresses the issue about what is morally valuable, in the sense of standing in principle the constraint on our achievement of our goals and wishes. Or if we're a virtue ethicist, about what we should be magnanimous towards. That's to say, one important way in which you can look at things in ethics is to say, well, look, we've got various concerns, desires, and wishes. And something that ethics tells us about is what should we allow to frustrate our pursuit of these things because it deserves a certain kind of moral respect. The second elaborates what in different circumstances it might be appropriate to treat as a human right. And my concern here is that it seems to me that we need to recognize a certain social relativity to what we take up as human rights, and that what makes sense in one socioeconomic system may not do in another. And let me give you an example here. I remember talking when I was in Australia to a group of traditional Aboriginal artists. And the chap who was effectively the leader of the group was saying, well, look, what really concerns us is that the wider society in Australia isn't concerned with sharing. And what I think this was all about, in some ways, I may be wrong about it, is that you have an ethic that's developed traditionally among many Aboriginal people, where if they're hunter-gatherers, if someone, say, manages to spear a kangaroo and it's brought back to the group, then basically the food needs to be shared. I mean, it makes no sense to try and accumulate anything because you've only got to carry it around and it's likely to rot and so on. By contrast with that, in a society like ours, then the accumulation of savings, which can be invested in tools, invested in capital processes and so on, becomes really important. And what this seems to me to suggest is that depending on the kind of society in which you're living, then the recognition of people as having rights of one sort might make sense here, and rights of another sort might make sense here. And in consequence, I personally am rather skeptical about the project of proclaiming that we all have to understand there to be universal human rights. I would certainly say that we need to understand that there are, as it were, sources of ethical value everywhere, but how these should be cashed out as rights looks to me personally something that has to be looked at within different sorts of social contexts. Choices may be made about these contexts and these systems, but they're not easy choices, and they might also involve a lot of rather difficult social change, so that if you want people to be respected in a particular way, if you want to cash out particular notions of rights, this may force on us some really quite difficult rethinking about how our society is going to work. It seems to me that treating everything here as just human rights within a system in which particularly they may not fit may do a lot of harm. That is a contentious opinion on my part, but it's something which I would commend to you should you be motivated to think of trying to fill out the sort of approach that Popper has taken a bit further in these areas. The other thing that I'd like to conclude on is the issue of ethical theory and metaphysics. I think that the kinds of arguments that Popper discusses in his appendix to the second volume of The Open Society are impressive. We surely can consider that it's possible to learn that we're wrong in our ethical judgments as individuals, or that societies of which we've been part have been doing things really very badly wrong. There may be problems about how our societies have behaved in the past and how they're behaving now. think only of the way in which slavery was treated as ethically acceptable as an institution for thousands of years. I mean, you certainly had injunctions to people to be merciful towards uh, uh, their slaves, and that there were certain kind of things they shouldn't do to them. But this, the notion that slavery as such, as an institution, was okay, really was something that was only moved away from relatively recently. Also consider the way in which women have been treated in the past, and also the kind of disregard of the well-being of animals that has taken place. Where if one thinks back, say, to the glories of Shakespeare's writing, you think also, well, that was appreciated, but at the same time outside, there were people who were going in for bear baiting, for kind of torturing bears for fun. And there's a sense in which, from our position now, we might think, gosh, you know, there are all those things which were happening, which were actually terrible. But then equally, there may be things that are problematic about how we're doing things now. However, one can ask, okay, if there is this learning, just what do we take to be happening here? That's to say, are there ethical truths which, all things being well, we can gradually discover, in respect of which there's some kind of a parallel with the discovery of factual truth? And if so, what is the character of these ethical truths, and how do they fit into the furniture of the universe? I mean, we've got something that seems, as it were, to work perfectly well if we're just talking about us. But if you talk, well, let's take a bigger picture about this. Can we actually make sense of it in the large of it, as it were? It's more tricky. Some people claim that one can only make sense of such ideas from a religious perspective. It's not clear to me personally how that helps at all. But there is, however, I think, a challenge from a rather different direction. For an interesting line of argument has been offered, which combines two different threads of consideration here. The first is philosophical, and is to be found, for example, in J.L. Mackie's so-called error theory of ethics. The idea here is that while it looks as if we can make ethical discoveries in the way that I've described, what is going on may not, in fact, be ethical at all. We may just have the wrong category here. And in the light of our earlier discussion of Duhem, we might say that what is being opened up here is the possibility of a fact-correcting explanation of what is going on in this phenomenon not being the kind of thing that we thought that it was. Such an approach becomes interesting if one has a possible candidate for what the alternative explanation might consist of. And here it seems to me that an interesting line of argument is one offered by a particular theme in Richard Dawkins' book, In The Selfish Gene. Just one theme in that work. The idea here is not that we're all innately selfish, but rather that if you look at what is preserved as being not us, but the genetic material that we carry, which is also shared by other people, then the kinds of moral attitudes which we instinctively have might be understood as something that's been selected for in order that our genetic material can be better preserved. We typically feel the way we do about our kids and our immediate relatives. That we have this feeling is explained in terms of the benefits to the genetic material that we are all carrying, of our behaving in this way, often in ways which are altruistic and which might call for self-sacrifice on the part of the individual. I should stress that it's not argued that we have some way in which we detect what genetic material other people are carrying. Rather, it works by way of our having dispositions to behave in ways which would typically, but not necessarily any longer in our own highly mobile societies, benefit those with whom we share this genetic material. And so the notion was that if in the early years of mankind, you had people living in small groups, often quite closely related to one another, then the members of those groups would be sharing a good bit of genetic material. And with the idea then that if we had ethical feelings of loyalty towards, even in some cases to the point of willingness for self-sacrifice of ourselves for the sake of them, this wouldn't help us as individuals, but it might indeed aid the flourishing of that shared genetic material. I should stress that I'm not saying that this approach which Dawkins popularized is correct. My point in raising it was simply to suggest the kind of thing that could be offered as a fact-correcting explanation in this area, as to say of explaining why we have things that look like ethical predispositions, even if it's not actually the case that we can make any sense of an objective ethics. And indeed, it's something which, if it were correct, could serve to explain both how we have strong ethical feelings upon which we could create a realm within which other people could learn, but where, if such an explanation was true, its actual character would be very different from how it appears. That's to say, someone might be motivated to sacrifice themselves for a couple of kids. If you say to them, well, what's actually going on here is that you're being impelled to sacrifice yourself for the sake of the better survival of some genetic material, you might say, well, look, if I know that, and that is actually what it's all about, I don't really care a stuff about that genetic material. I'll just look after myself, thanks very much. And that's to say, knowing the truth about this might serve to undermine its normative character. We might still feel very strongly those feelings, but we would treat it as being something more like or analogous to a visual illusion, not something which we should actually trust and act upon. This is obviously just a sketch, and clearly if we have such dispositions, we can make discoveries within the realms that they create, much as we can within the realms created by our musical and artistic dispositions and the conventions that we then set up. So we discover things in World 3. My point in raising this, however, is that it poses an interesting challenge to our ordinary way of looking at morality and its authority. And it seems to me that it's something that points to the importance of those, the importance that people like me who are inclined to take ethical concerns at their face value, that we should rather develop and defend as cogent against this kind of critical alternative, an account of the status of ethics. That's to say, I think we should actually take up something which Popper himself, I think, wished at all costs to avoid getting entangled with. Thank you all very much. Can we move now over to discussion? And just indicate if you would like to talk. I've got Luke indicating that he wants to get to address this.
Yeah, I would like to say a lot of things, but the first thing I would want to say is that I have a different view of Popper's protectionism. As far as I can judge, Popper wants to protect the weak because they are not free. He wants to make them free. And it's quite comparable to what Amartya Sen writes in his book, Development as Freedom. If you're poor, you are not free to choose an agreement about how much you will earn to work. You are forced to work at a low wage. If you are disabled, you are not free to have social contacts unless people help you and so on. So what Popper is actually saying is that we should help people in order to be free. And the state, of course, the state can be very powerful, but if you look, and Philip Benes writes about this in his book, The Viennese Socrates, that he wants to limit all power within the state. He wants to limit the power of parliament. He wants to limit all power in all kinds of ways. Of course, it will, so that it is distributed. And yeah, of course, there's nothing can ever be fair. That's what he says also, Popper. It is always something that has to be done in practice, and it's not easy. And there's always a danger, of course, of authoritarianism. But, and also, have you read, I think you have read that book of Mariano Artigas, the Spanish
Popper's Ethics.
Oh, yeah. I think it's
no, I think I will discuss that when I turn to talking about Bartley. I think it's a terrible book.
I like
so
it.
I will lamb into that reasonably hard.
Okay,
I think
like
it's dreadful.
That will be interesting.
But as I said, on these issues, there are two separate kinds of concerns. There's the stuff I talked about today, and then there's this issue about fideism and comprehensively critical rationalism and so on. And I'll take the Artigas stuff in that. Now, on the first point, I guess what I'd say is, look, it seems to me that Popper's protectionism is in part concerned with sort of traditional liberal concerns about protecting people, but he's also concerned with protecting people from economic exploitation. The difficulty really is that Popper doesn't say anything much about the structure of an open society or about the organization of it. So he simply leaves these things as agendas for governmental action. And I guess that, I mean, it's a little difficult to know quite what to do with these bits of Popper, because he certainly seems to be someone who personally was worried about state bureaucracy, and he raised against socialist friends the problem that what they favored seemed just to run into the creation of state bureaucracies. But he didn't really tell us, well, how are these issues going to be addressed? And by what means? Now, you could certainly say, well, there are issues about development, and you could take the, the Sen and Nussbaum material as putting forward some theories about how this should be tackled. I think, though, that there are some questions about this, because you have to ask, well, how are societies envisaged actually as operating? If people have certain particular traditions and ways of life, how are they to be changed? And I think a big problem here is that if we look at these matters, we'd often say, well, what would be rather nice is something that was a bit like Scandinavia, but not quite as robotic, as it were. And there's a lot that's attractive about it. But on the other hand, there is, I think, the problem, given where different people are, given the cultures they're coming out of, given their different beliefs and concerns, how do you get them to something better? And also, who is the you that is doing this? I mean, that we're not, I mean, it's difficult for most of us to take care to the limited extent that we do of our own lives. The notion that have got the capability of running other people's lives for them becomes, I think, even trickier. So I guess what I would say is, look, if one thinks that this is an important issue, then really what one has to do is to start exploring feasibly how it's to be done. And practical problems here are, if you give the responsibility to the state, then there are some ways of modernizing society that actually seem to be pretty effective. But we wouldn't always like the effectiveness involved. I mean, Singapore in the small or China in the large have been very effective at doing certain kinds of things, but in ways where we hardly want to take that as a model. But if you say, okay, where are other models of really effective development undertaken by states or governments, I think we have to look round pretty hard for cases where it works. If you then say, no, you want to have voluntary agencies doing it, well, I mean, they may do a lot of good. They may have to spend an enormous amount of time putting winsome pictures of kids onto people's television screens to beg for money, and then spend a lot of time kind of zooming around other people's countries in Land Rovers, where one really wonders just how effective it is. So I think my feeling would be, if one's inspired by this, let's actually get to work to explicate feasible agendas and to discuss their merits.
Yeah, but I remember that Hans Albert wrote somewhere that open societies can be different, and that they don't all have to be the same. They start from a different start, and they develop in a different way. They don't have to be the same, but we can assess whether they are more or less open. There is no absolutely open society. Yeah.
Well, that's true enough, but the question is, if one is concerned with the problem that you put on the table about people who are really in a very bad situation, do we have models which we can offer to people as, I mean, you can always say, right, you just have to do this for yourselves, but is there anything we can offer as tentative models for people in different kinds of situations which might work effectively? And all I'm saying is, I think this is something that really needs to be done, setting out in a fairly cold-blooded way just what the pros and cons of different kinds of models are. I mean,
okay, but I'm curious to hear what Philip Benesch will say about it, because he wrote a book about all these stuff.
Well,
so it's interesting.
Philip has just indicated that he'd like to pose a question.
Yeah, I'd love to hear him.
Philip.
He wrote a very good book. Yeah,
well, I think Margarita was just ahead of me, so I should wait my turn. I think she's...
Philip, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is Margarita hasn't got a picture up and she hasn't got a hand up. So
yeah. No, I say Philip should go ahead, and I'll wait for my comments.
Philip.
Okay. Well, I thank you very much for that very nice plug, by the way, Luke. Thank you. What I would suggest, however, is that Popper was committed to what effectively is a human rights model, at least in the open society and its enemies, and talks about ways in which that might indeed be enforced at an international level. So although there may well be significant differences in some policies between different open societies, and of course it would be the states that are different. The assumption, I think, that Popper had is that all states would be held to broad, global, in effect, human rights standards. He went so far as to suggest that while it wouldn't be desirable to have an international government or a world government, that you would have a strong executive at the international level that might well send in troops where there is an abuse of human rights or a tendency to erode the freedoms seen as central to the open society. So I disagree a little with what Lucas said and what Jeremy has said in rejecting the human rights path, if you will, in Popper. But that was just something that had occurred to me when Luke was talking of that. I'll stand back and let others go next.
If I could just comment very briefly, I mean, Popper certainly was attracted to international initiatives. Whether that is actually a good path to go down, I would take some convincing. And for the reasons that I indicated briefly, I personally think that models of, I actually personally think that the whole approach of human rights is a terrible one, and that what we need to do rather is to think about what is of value, but then to consider how this can best be realized under various different sorts of social circumstances.
Can I just very briefly come back? And I mean, I think you're of course you're right, but at the same time, what we value on a global, you know, that search for common standards, which I think is where ultimately, I mean, you don't want it to be too extensive because that becomes oppressive. You want scope for experimentation at the local level and regional level, but ultimately, the human rights path is, if you will, a kind of identification and codification of a shared sense of decency or a shared sense of justice, in fact. And Popper explores this, I think, quite extensively in the first volume of The Open Society, and devotes indeed an entire chapter to a the humanitarian theory of justice, a very, very substantial part there, and he explores it elsewhere as well in The Open Society. I think it's important to relate that to Popper's other statements, and the other component within Popper and the minimization of suffering component within Popper. He rejects a utilitarian approach, but he seems to develop the approach that he holds initially, at least, very much as a development out of Marxism, a humanitarian development, a saving from Marxism of the humanitarian concern with reduced proletarian suffering and the ending of proletarian exclusion, I think, to a very substantial extent, and his subsequent policies relate to that. Anyway, I'm going to
look. I would just say two things. I mean, I think you're completely right that all of that is there. I guess my concern about it is that Popper quite positively, as it were, in his criticisms of the many things that he includes as essentialism, actually steers away from being able to get to grips with what institutions are going to be needed in order to accomplish various different things and what constraints they'll impose on us. And I guess I can put what I'm saying in the following terms. I mean, Popper's ethical concerns are all there. I think personally that because he didn't explore the institutional issues, he didn't really face what some of the difficulties were about certain of the things that he was favoring. And so all I would want to say to people is, if you're attracted by Popper's program, then I think that a good deal of filling this stuff in terms of talking about economic and political structures is really needed, and that one may then have to rethink how these things are done once that has been explicated. So I'm not disagreeing with you about Popper. I'm saying I personally think that there is a problem over Popper's agenda in the open society, but it's one which it's no surprise that he wasn't able to address himself. Margareta, you've been, your tiny hand is glowing, as it were.
So this thank you to Philip, because he kind of raised some of the questions and concerns that I wanted to raise, so I can't be accused of criticizing or bringing them up. But having said that, let me start with something positive. I always thought when people talk about human rights, they should also talk about human responsibilities. And so that brings us back to the arena of moral responsibility. And that is really a question, I think, that is below the surface in Popper's writings everywhere. I think so. That is my impression. So I want to hear, what is your impression, that even if he doesn't talk about it, I mean, that is what I hear you say, that he's really think that's something very important, and he's trying to talk about it in other ways or indirectly.
Philip, that was addressed to you, was it?
Oh, it's to both of you.
Yes, I'll defer to you, Jeremy.
No, it's fine. Do go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think Popper avoids moralizing and moral preaching. He doesn't want to tell us what our responsibilities are. So I think I mean, there is discussion about avoidance of causing additional suffering. There is a concern with the consequences of our policies and the moral principles that inform them. But beyond, but he's deliberately not prescriptive of what we are responsible for and what actions we should take, I think. So
okay.
So it is quite truly a minimizing process. It is the equivalent in ethics of his approach to eliminating error in our scientific theories, or arguably in politics, again, a negative approach of removing bad or corrupt or oppressive rulers. I think so. It is addressing the harms, not the responsibilities, I think.
Okay, thank you.
And if I could add one other tiny thing, Popper was at the first meeting of the Montpellier Society, and this is often pointed to as an organization connected with neoliberalism. Popper went there because in support of his friend Friedrich Hayek, but he had said to Hayek, you should invite socialists to come and join this organization, provided that they are kind of not totalitarian. There is a little bit of a transcript of the discussion at the first meeting. And at one point, I think they were talking about some ideas that Milton Friedman had for a so-called negative income tax. I mean, the idea that if people were poor or say were having suffering from certain disabilities, they would just automatically each year get a cash payout while other people are having to pay their tax. And there was discussion amongst a number of people at the meeting, including economists, about unemployment relief. And certain of the economists were rather skeptical about it. Hayek seemed to think that you should have it, but not at a very high level and with certain disabilities on people. Popper was all in favor, said in effect, well, it's bad enough that people are suffering from being unemployed. They should get the average wage. Now, one can appreciate Popper's ethical concern on this. On the other side of it, one also has to think, okay, how do we actually have an economy that functions, given that people are, for the most part, having to be paid to do things that they probably wouldn't want to do otherwise? How does that, or can that impulse really be handled? And what I was trying to suggest before is that, I mean, in some ways, it seems to me personally that it's only if you talk about the institutions of such a society, or what for a particular society is or isn't possible for you, and what the constraints are if you make this choice or make that choice, that you can then address how to deal with these matters. And that certainly there are important choices to be made, but there are choices, and as was said very often in the context of Brexit discussions, the big issue is that you can't have your cake and eat it. Now, in a British context, the problem was that they never seemed to be able to get our current Prime Minister to understand this. But I think that in terms of cashing out the ideas of the open society, one has a whole lot of very important, interesting, and pertinent ideas, which, in my judgment, then have to be met with ideas about institutional design, taking different lots of people in the situation where they are currently. I mean, there are some very difficult problems. For example, in Britain, there was, after the Second World War, large-scale immigration to Britain from some areas in rural Pakistan, and the people who came to Britain from there had really a very traditional, rather communal life, close-knit families, a lot of intermarriage, an interplay between their particular understanding of Islam and the patterns of life that they adopted, which in many ways they were able to replicate in some northern towns in Britain. The problem is that this seems to have all kinds of problems about it. But the difficulty is, well, what at the level of public policy do you actually do? Do you force openness on people? Do you disregard their religious views? Do you say all women have to be educated and basically moved into the workforce? Because in some respects, that would be the best way to get a lot of the concerns of the open society. Or do you say, no, you can't possibly coerce people, but what should you then be doing? Or is it something that anyone else other than the people concerned should be addressing? And I would see in our present juncture, over and over again, all kinds of problems of roughly this sort as to how do you do public policy given the varied places that we're in and given the quite radical changes that are taking place at the moment. So it looks to me both tricky, but also to involve an enormous amount of hard work.
All right. If I may, I had another question, and
Yes, of course.
that is a comment that you made, and I think that's where Popper can be helpful. That is, you talked about the state, and I couldn't help but my ears pricked up because there are two views in sociology, and so one is that there are groups or the anti-cavity or whatever what this is called. Donald Campbell, he implies, and it's also Durkheim a little bit, this whole idea that there is the group with properties of its own, but there's also the view of the state as a nexus of contracts or a nexus of constitutions and laws. And so in that view, there is no state. And there is our neighbor who goes to work in a building that is called government building, but is actually our fellow human beings. So the way that I understood the significance of Karl Popper is that he's pointing out we have a lot of empty constructs that we are not removing out of our discussion, and they kind of block the discussion. And especially today, when everyone is talking about the Democrats and the Republicans and capitalism and socialism and communism, these are all empty constructs in some way, because we don't talk about the people that are behind them. So I just wanted to raise this question in the context of the state, because I was surprised to hear you say the state as opposed to government employees or elected politicians.
Well,
or as bureaucrats.
Okay. What I'd say is this. Popper's agenda in the open society is one which looks to me that he's offering a procedure for the setting of governmental policy. Okay. And I was talking in this context about the state just for two reasons. First, because he sees he sees his protectionism as working in terms of what government does and secures. And the issue that I was raising is, well, yes, that's all very well, but another dimension to this problem is how basically we control what government does, because government may sometimes be the source of our problems. A second issue is, I'd want to stress very much that I disagree personally with a strand in Popper's anti-essentialism, because it seems to me that we need to look very hard at how government and features of society and the economy are structured, just because if we have certain institutions in place, then this opens up some possibilities for us, but closes other ones off. And my worry about the open society is that Popper essentially sees us sort of getting together and making reasonable demands for rational reform. But because he doesn't talk about the organization of things, he doesn't face what I think is a real problem, that in some cases we may find that there are things which it would be very attractive to have, which we can't have if we have these institutions in place, but there may be for us no alternative to having those institutions. And so I think there has to be a kind of interplay between our knowledge of the institutions and the unintended consequences of having them, but also knowledge about, well, if we don't want these, how else could things be done? And at the more ordinary level, our concern about what's morally reasonable and so on. And I just think that if one likes Popper's open society, then that next task of fleshing that out becomes something very important. Okay.
Yes, so would you then comment on the following, that together with governments or states, there have been always immediately corporations as separate institutions, like the India Corporation or Christopher Columbus, collecting money for his expedition across the ocean. So if
Sorry,
you want
I don't quite understand your question.
my question is, okay, just I appreciate, yes, open society, there are areas that need to be further developed. So there is clearly, there are many loose ends in it. But instead of being concerned about the government, I mean, not maybe say the institutions that we have, and acknowledge that there are two other very important institutions that play a role. And one is the corporation, and the other is the university. That is kind of the institution that transfers knowledge across generations, so to say. So should we like focus on those two institutions instead of worrying about the state? Should we be positively engaged in thinking about how to look at all those different institutions instead of having a tunnel vision about limiting the power of the state?
Well, I wasn't suggesting we should just do that. All I was saying was that while I think if one's concerned with Popper's notion of protectionism, that while some things which are run by the state, such as the court system and so on, play a really important role there are all sorts of other things which we just need to understand. And if we have, for example, the sorts of values to which Popper is attached in the open society, then I think we have to pose the question, how might things have to be organized so that those sorts of concerns and values could be realized? And this is a matter of, I mean, this sort of brings in how pretty much everything works, but where the sort of problems that it poses are by and large ones which I think Popper didn't address for perfectly good reason in the open society, but where if one gets interested and excited by his work, then I think become key things to be getting on with. Now, it isn't a matter then of rediscovering the wheel, because it's clear that if you read the literature on public policy, if you read literature on political science, if you read literature in different areas of economics and so on, you immediately get thrown up various kinds of problems about how you might, if you have this way of doing things, then be able to achieve some of the kind of concerns that Popper is wanting us to pursue. Can I just check how we're doing now? Are there other questions that people have? Can you wave if you want to get into the discussion? Anyone? Ulrich.
Yeah, hi, Jeremy. Just a quick follow-up on the very nice exchange you had also with Philip and Margareta and Luc. So I think it would be really extremely useful to try and attempt preparing kind of a series or a single textbook monograph on critical rationalism as opposed to just Popperian philosophy, although of course there is a lot of overlap, right? But to really compile what is sort of a common consensus. I guess there is a lot of material that most critical rationalists would agree to. And then what are these perspectives that you guys now outlined where people diverge and so on? Because in science, as we practice it in the natural sciences, right, you have lots of these textbooks that then go about methods. I mean, it's physical chemistry or X-ray crystallography or molecular dynamics, right? More modern techniques that have a lot of open questions where you can have a fundamental thing that everybody would agree to more or less, and then you have future perspectives and so on. And I'm a layperson, but when I looked at the literature, I didn't find anything like that. And so I would really like just to encourage you, Jeremy, but also the others who are present to try and compile something like that. And I think your lecture notes would make an excellent start. And then say also where there are the open ends nowadays.
Okay, what I would say is you're talking about a very small number of people, most of whom are now a bit too old to be able to get anything much done. I mean, part of the problem, it's a twofold problem. Popper was teaching essentially in a very small department, which was concerned with the history and philosophy of science. And in Britain, it didn't make very much impact in the sense that his graduate students, I mean, there are not many of them who got appointments anywhere. If you now look to see what the situation is, suppose someone said to me, I'm really interested in critical rationalism. I'd like to go and do a PhD supervised by someone. Who could I work with? Well, most of the people who are most strongly associated with critical rationalism are retired. One of my reasons for putting on these talks was to say, well, it might not be bad to try and set out one systematic approach to this informally so that I can get feedback from people and perhaps improve it. In the areas we've been talking about today, I think that you get a quite significant divide. I have argued that while Popper was, I mean, Popper became in Germany almost a sort of patron saint, both for the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. I mean, there were books written by both sides saying how wonderful he was. But my impression is that amongst people who've been interested in Popper's work on and got interest in political and economic issues, there really is quite a divide between some people who have stayed, I think, closer in some ways to the spirit of Popper's work and have wanted to hash these things out as a form of social democracy. And other people who really said, no, actually, that just doesn't work, that there is a lot of stuff in the literature on political science and economics, which suggests that you have to think in terms of realizing these things in rather different directions. Now, I have done my bit for the second of those strands in the book that I wrote about Popper's political thought, which, I mean, it's still in print, but to my knowledge, no one has ever really bought it or engaged with the arguments in it. And I've tended to.
I have bought it, though.
Well, it's very nice if people have bought it. I mean, you could just simply send me money, but my concern was more that there are people who are. I mean, I'm just trying to think of the name of the guy. So it's Fred Eiglin, for example, a Canadian political scientist, wrote quite extensively on that sort of theme. Mark Noturno has written stuff which I personally think is just hopeless about Popper and Hayek. I think he just doesn't understand Hayek, and when I tried to explain where it's wrong, he seemed to me not to pay the slightest attention. But so in part, what I've tried to do is to make arguments to these people saying, look, I think that you've got it wrong, but that at the same time, I equally think that sort of gung-ho free marketeers are completely wrong in trying to line Popper up with them. So I would see this as being an area that has to be explored in some detail, but that in my judgment, there is a lot of very interesting work in the literature on public administration. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating stuff on the problem of implementation. If you have different government agencies, how can you actually get them to work together to achieve some outcome that people want given that each of them have got their own separate agenda and have no institutional incentive in really getting to where you would hope that they would be. So my feeling really is that there's just a whole mass of work that needs to be done, but where the problem is, who is going to do it? Because I don't know how long I'm going to last, but I mean, I'm in my early 70s now. I suspect that in 10 years' time, I will be probably past anything but looking after the cat, but we shall just have to see.
But well, I mean, I see the challenge, of course, right? But actually all the more since you say that there are not so many active faculty members fully associating with critical rationalism anymore or whatever, I think all the more, again, I would just encourage you to just try and compile this outline again with the open question, right? You cannot resolve everything in depth, yes, of course, right? But if there is only a handful of people on the planet or a couple of dozen or so who dealt with that seriously anyhow, then all the more it might be feasible to compile a bit, and then with your perspective, right, or whoever joins in to write such a book together, maybe it's easiest by yourself if there are so many disagreements. To have this, I think, would be extremely valuable also to outsiders, so to say.
Well, it is possible that it might, I mean, these lectures are intending to set out things reasonably systematically. If people get back to me and complain, then I can improve them, and it's just possible that this might add up to something. My threat, as it were, is that there could be a second series of some of these things which explores things a little further. But we shall just see how far we go, and whether there is anyone who would have any. I mean, I suppose one could always do these things and make the recordings even if there wasn't anyone else listening at all. I mean, I haven't thought of that.
And you can always do a volume 2, of course, right?
Yeah. Now, any other questions, or should we call a halt?
I just want to add something. I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic, because on Facebook, Karl Popper is quite successful. Eh? Many people read what I put. What I do actually is just put some quotes, and when they read Popper, a quote of Popper, many people are interested in who wrote, because he was a great writer. Eh? So it's not. We shouldn't be very pessimistic. The problem is that many people don't know about Popper. Once they read something of him, many people like it. So that's the way to do it. I think that's the way to do it. Yeah, but we will see what happens.
I would see, and I've been planning to do the final lecture on this, part as Popper the person, but also on the notion of critical rationalism as a research program, because it seems to me that it's something which you basically need a number of people who are interested, but then operating in sort of friendly come hostile collaboration in suggesting where things should go. Okay, for now. Well, next week we've got some stuff about Popper and Kuhn. So I'll be circulating something about that. Philip actually looked at the things that I'd suggested people had to look at in advance for this, and then said, Jeremy, your reference doesn't make any sense. And so I've now corrected that, and I will check it before I send the next one out. Okay, thank you all very much. Cheerio for now. Bye-bye.